Welcome to the Bros of Gardening. I'm your host, Mike Westphal. I'm here with Daniel Van Dyke, my co-host. And in the background, you'll hear his voice. You won't see his face, is our producer, Alex, who will be helping guide us through our topic today, which is small space gardening. So pretty big topic.
Absolutely.
What does it mean to you?
So, it's something we've seen a lot more of, obviously, the landscape world and kind of the housing world is ever changing. And we've seen a lot of, you see these people that don't necessarily have these huge yards or even more importantly, they don't want these huge areas.
Right.
Obviously we've touched on low maintenance a few episodes ago. And obviously one really easy way to cut down on maintenance is to cut down on the amount of space you have. And so you see a lot of people downsizing or not even necessarily downsizing the houses, but just the outdoor space. And so then what you really have to do is try to think through, okay, how do I maximize the potential of this space? Because you don't have an overwhelming amount of space to just kind of play with. And so that's where I think the small space gardening, container gardening, a lot of these different types of things are going to come into play because, you're trying to get all you can out of this area. And that's where it really comes into what you want out of that space. And that's where you have to be a little bit more specific and a little bit more detailed when you really think through and kind of plan
what your expectations are.
But, that's kind of what it means on the landscape side of things. I'm sure y'all get a lot of that in the retail world as well.
Oh yeah. I mean, and it can come from so many different directions. Like you said, it's, hey, I've got too big of a yard. I don't want to maintain this anymore. I'm moving into a smaller space. Or it could be, hey, I want to turn this into a smaller space. I want, a small private space to maybe entertain or, to enjoy dinners at night, whatever it might be. So there's lots of different reasons. I mean, certainly I have customers that come up and say, I only have full sun in this one spot. What can I do?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's like, well, I want to grow vegetables or I want to grow edible plants and I need full sun and I've only got it in this one spot, but it happens to be on my deck.
Yep.
So, hey, now we're into small space gardening, we're into container gardening, and it goes on and on and on from there. So it can come from so many different places and there's a lot of different solutions. I think that's what's cool about it is you can go a lot of different directions. I mean, you think back into I think it's like 40s and 50s, where small space gardening was the square foot garden, raised beds. I mean, falls into this category too. So lots and lots of possibilities and lots of different solutions to help customers, whether they're landscape or retail, walking into the stores to help them with their small space needs.
Absolutely.
So Alex, what you got for us?
When someone does start with their only space that they can have being a small bed or a patio, what would be the two of you? What would you guys recommend?
So I think, again, for me, the most important thing, again, you can look at it from different ways, but, when we approach it from a landscape design and installation standpoint, what we're really trying to figure out from that customer is what do you want to utilize this space for? And so for small space gardening, that can mean a lot of different things. If you're somebody who wants to entertain a lot, you may want to, incorporate some type of a patio area, or maybe you already have a patio area, but you want to leave as much of that area open for entertaining. You want to have a 8-person dining set out there. And so those are all the types of things you kind of have to think through when you first start kind of initially planning out.
Yep.
And that would be my biggest recommendation is don't just start buying a bunch of containers, don't start buying a bunch of plant material that you think looks nice. Is think through that and think through kind of how you want to allocate that space. Because again, I mean, that's one of the things you have to realize is you might not necessarily be able to have everything. And so you really want to kind of pinpoint what you want. And so I would say take your time on planning it out would be probably where I would start, and really think about how you want to utilize that space so that you get the most personal enjoyment out of it. And again, a lot of times that's questions like, do you want to entertain? You mentioned edible gardening, which, we could go on for a while about that in and of itself. But again, if that's something you want to do, you may want to try to find the sunny spot in your area, your small space garden, your patio, whatever the case may be. And then, start to, again, we talk about it all the time, is how much do you want to work on these, whether it's a container or a small garden, and, that can be solved different ways. You can do rock gardens are very popular in
Yep.
small spaces. And you
Right.
want to, and again, if you're not trying to do a lot of maintenance and stuff like that, that's a really nice way to enhance a small space and really make a statement.
Yeah.
Rocks, boulders, whatever the case may be. And so there's a lot of different ways you can do it. But as far as how to get started, I would say really think about what you want to do with that space and kind of plan out how you want to allocate that space so that you can get the most out of it.
Yeah, planning for sure. And I think, it depends on, what level of a gardener you might be.
Sure.
Are you a plant collector? Then you want a lot of smaller plants. Maybe you come from a space that was big and you had some favorite plants and it's like, I really need those in this space.
Sure.
That's how we can help kind of guide you and kind of, start with that. You mentioned vegetables and edible plants, but whether you need that in a small space, we can help you tackle those problems. It really depends on what your expectations are. If you're not an experienced gardener, it's very much that. It's, I want privacy. I need privacy in this small space, or I want color, or I want a tropical feel, or I want to entertain. Those are the questions that we'll ask you on a retail side to say, hey, and I know you'll do it on the landscape side, which is, what do you want out of this space?
Yep,
And that's where you start with, and then the possibilities are endless from there.
Well, we've talked about so much about the positives of small space gardening. What kind of challenges can come up with doing this, though?
Well, I think without being redundant, obviously the biggest obstacle you have to overcome, kind of like we alluded to in the planning stage, is you don't have an overwhelming amount of space. So you have to be a little bit more selective with what you want to do. Now, that's a challenge, but it's not, it obviously, again, like we've touched on, can create a positive as well. Obviously, some of the issues that you're going to run into, take container gardening specifically. There are certain, challenges you face with containers in the sense of, they, depending on what container you go with, if you want to have to be able to move those containers around, there's weight restrictions and things like that. And again, it goes into how much you want to put into it. Containers, can drain quicker. They might require a little bit of additional watering than maybe plants you've planted. And again, from a traffic area, you have to pay attention to things like that. If you don't have a huge space, you can't do these big bulky containers or plants or plant material. In small spaces, you might not be able to plant your favorite tree because you don't have a ton of space, or maybe you're up close to the house on the front foundation, something to that aspect. So there are a lot of challenges with it, but you can get creative, and that's what I always say is try out different things. Just play with different things and kind of find what you like from a, whether it's plant material, whether it's selection and location of containers, veggie gardens. I mean, you just kind of got to play with it, but you do have some inherent challenges with that because you don't have that overwhelming amount of space where if you try something out, you can just move it somewhere else. And so I think one of the biggest challenges we deal with on the landscape side of things is foot traffic and entertaining space. Dealing with we install patios and things like that. Well, and then you want to load it up with a bunch of containers, and all of a sudden it starts to make that space feel even smaller. And so that's one of the big challenges that we run into is you don't want to create an environment where you feel really tight. You want it to feel as open and free flowing as possible. And so that's one of the biggest challenges that we deal with when dealing with these type of spaces is how to not make it feel too tight. You don't want anybody to feel claustrophobic when you're sitting on the back patio. And so I think there's different challenges that come with that we try to get creative and try to come up with some unique solutions for.
And don't get discouraged. I mean, and if you got small space, if you just have a deck or a patio or a porch and you got no soil space, containers are an amazing option. I mean, they open up so many different possibilities from annual combinations, which offer a lot of color, to hanging baskets. I'm kind of messing around with, using a lot of different types of perennials. I've got a very shady front yard. I've got it's even more shady when you add the front porch onto it. And I've got a collection of old containers that I'm, playing with, putting a lot of different types of perennials in just to kind of give me that perennial kind of shade garden feel. You can do shrubs, you can do trees. The possibilities really are endless. I mean, citrus is a great one. Citrus you can't even grow in the ground here in our area, so you have to grow it in a container.
Embrace it.
Gives you a tropical look. It's an edible plant. You can bring it in during the winter, but got a challenge. You got to think about, do I want to put this in a big ceramic pot? Do I have a lot of wind? Am I going to put rock in the bottom? Am I going to make it heavier? Is it going to be impossible to move? All of those things so planning, of course, comes into it, but containers open up a huge realm of possibilities of what you can do when it comes to small space gardening.
Well, and I think, some people might look at containers and how they are maybe a little bit more, from a plant material standpoint, temporary.
Yep.
But I say lean into that,
Yeah.
like play with it and, try color combinations, try different plants. And if you're not nuts about it, well, the good news is you're going to rip it out in a couple months and
Right.
plant something different. And so if you kind of lean into that mentality, it's easier to be creative and try different things. Again, going back to kind of the landscape side of things, when you're dealing with these big beds that, and at other locations, you plant 35 of one plant. Well, let's say that plant doesn't exactly, grow or come out to be the plant that you thought it would be. And so then you have to replace 35 of them. Well, with container gardening, you can try different things, and if it isn't what you like, well, then maybe you're replacing one or two of them,
Right.
but kind of lean into the temporary feel of it. And so you can get more creative and be a little bit more ambitious in some things with your plant choices. You don't have to be as reserved, and it's a little bit more fun to play with. And that's why even if you do have a big landscape, kind of like you mentioned, you can create a small space.
For sure.
That you can kind of have some more fun in and be a little bit more
Right.
creative and use containers as that. And I even recommend using containers in difficult places. If you have a
Right,
tree
for
stump,
sure.
that stump can create kind of a pedestal for a pot. I mean, that's
Yeah.
one way to get rid of a stump. If you can't get rid of that, in other ways, or even if you just have a problem area from a drainage standpoint that stays really wet, and you can put rock down and then kind of put a pot down, to kind of enhance that area, but keep the root system up out of the wet area, so that you can still grow and have kind of a focal point with that. So it's, again, just be creative with it, and you can have fun with it and kind of lean into the
Right.
temporary aspect of it.
Yeah. I think, annuals give you a ton of color.
Sure.
So if you're looking for a colorful, whether it's a tropical vibe, whether it's just, a spring kind of look, whether it's even the fall colors, I mean, you can get amazing combinations with annuals. And I mean, the easy recipe there is our spiller, thriller, and filler. So you got your spiller that hangs over the sides of your container, your filler that kind of fills up the middle portion, and your thriller that's usually the higher, taller, kind of spectacular plant that kind of fills out the top layer. And that's kind of goes into design in general,
Sure.
landscape design, interior design. I mean, it all kind of works together. And so annuals are going to give you a great source of color. Perennials could give you a little bit of a garden feel. I mix in perennials with like boxwoods. So I've got like some containers with boxwoods, fern, hellebores, Lenten rose, those types of things that kind of all work together. Maybe some ivies mixed into there, some different
Sure.
of the variegated ivies. I love Fatsia, one of my all-time favorite
Absolutely.
plants. I have 3 different Fatsias now on my front porch. I've got just your traditional green one. I don't know if you've seen that new one, the camouflage. It's kind of got
have
some
not
green
seen
and
that
yellow. And then the spider web, which is a white variegated.
That one's probably my favorite.
Yeah, so they are awesome. They're evergreen. I've had challenges growing them in my yard, not because it's a hard plant to grow. It's actually pretty easy, but I've been known to have some moles and voles, and
Sure.
the voles love the root system of a
Absolutely.
Fatsia. But that's kind of where it goes back to my original point, which is, I love those plants. I struggle to grow them in certain areas, so containers give me the ability to do it.
Sure.
I mean, my first plant ever grown or ever bought from McDonald Garden Center was when I started 20 years ago, 19 years ago in the retail side. At one of our shows, I bought a small, it's now big, a small Japanese maple. It's a Shishigashira Japanese maple. It was this probably 6 to 8 inches tall. I grew it in a container for almost 20 years. I just planted it about 2 years ago in my landscape. So that plant grew for many, many years in a container. And it slowly but surely over time got upgraded into a bigger container. It became one of my prized possessions. It eventually needed to go in the ground.
Sure.
And so, I mean, no plant can live in a pot forever. Well, I say that, but bonsai would kind of correct me there. But I grew it very successfully for many years. Loved that plant. Eventually, I put it in the ground just because it needed more source of, a bigger source of soil and
Sure.
room to grow. But that's the thing that you can do. I mean, you can grow Japanese maples
and I
in
think
pots
that's
forever.
and that's again one of you talking about the challenges of obviously container gardening, but even just small space gardening in general is. Plants don't stop growing,
Right.
and so that's the thing is embracing kind of the concept of, whether it's a small space where the canopy or the bush or tree or shrub, whatever may overpower that area eventually because you don't have a lot of space.
Right.
And so again, there's two different ways to approach that. Do you try to pick things that are maybe a little bit more appropriate for that, or do again you lean into kind of the temporary aspect of it? Is, hey, I'm going to enjoy this for 3 or 4 years,
Right.
And so I know from personal experience, what I would do is I would grow Japanese maples in pots. And then I would, once they got out of that pot, I'd say, all right, now I'm going to go try to find a location in my yard, or, hey, I got a beautiful plant from my dad or my brother, or, use it as a gift, whatever the case may be. So I think, that's, containers and small spaces in general is you just have to be much more conscientious of the long term of that. And so, like you said, I love doing Japanese maples in pots, and a lot of people don't think about Japanese maples for container gardening or small space gardening. But again, that's just one of those plants that can really fit the bill, and that's where it comes down to just plant selection and things like that.
And mixing uses. I mean, annuals, you're going to have to replace.
Sure.
As the season changes, you're going to have to replace. But mixing it with a shrub or a tree, a Japanese maple, or, one of my favorites is like the autumn rocket camellia, tall, upright, pillar-shaped, column-shaped shrub, blooms in the winter. It's a fall blooming camellia. But you can underplant it with some, really nice annuals. And then next year, maybe it's just a shrub, or maybe you plant some perennial ground covers under it. I mean, the possibilities literally are endless when it comes to containers. So if you have a small space, I definitely recommend using some containers. What you got, Alex?
Well, funny enough, I have a small space, and I struggle so much with trying to, make it something that looks appealing, but also, kind of maintain it.
Right.
It has a giant pine tree in front of it. Sunlight can come in only through the morning, and it's very narrow. There's not a lot of walking room out there.
Right.
What would be perfect for that kind of area?
So I think obviously when dealing with narrow areas, again, kind of going back on what I talked about, is you don't want it to feel too tight. And so that's where I think, especially particularly when you're dealing with narrow spaces, is you don't want to overload it. Again, I love plants as much as the next guy. Obviously, we're doing a podcast about gardening and landscaping, but you don't want to get overly ambitious with your, the amount of containers. Picking containers that fit the space. Obviously, most containers people picture round containers.
Yep.
But they do make elongated, square, rectangular containers that are made for those exact situations where you can have, kind of a skinny pot that will fit that bill. And so I think, and then again, picking plant material that is going to grow much more vertically than it is out. And so it all comes back down to the plant selection and kind of the container selection, whether that's, again, if we're just talking about a small space, not necessarily a container, maybe you only have a 2-foot wide bed that runs along the edge of your patio. Yep. Well, again, that's going to come down to what type of plant material you're going to pick. You don't want to pick something that's overhanging and constantly going to be hitting you in the face as you walk by it. So you're going to want to pick something that's going to grow vertically. It's going to grow narrow. Maybe even training something on a trellis or something like that. It's a great option. A really popular way to do it. You can get a full bush, shrub, vine, whatever the case may be. And that's the thing, is trellises aren't just made for vines. I mean, you can do a espalier, which, for people who don't necessarily know what that means, that can be a shrub or something that's grown on, a trellis that kind of keeps it flat. I mean, I've seen camellias and things like that.
Seen really fruit trees like that. Yep.
Yeah, fruit trees. And so, again, that's a perfect example of something that's been created for this exact problem. Yep. And so there are a lot of creative solutions to it, but I would say it's all going to come down to just planning that space out so that you kind of pick and choose where you really want to have something.
Right.
And then again, whether it's an espalier or a trellis or even just a vertically grown plant, picking something, being conscientious of that is going to be where it really comes into play.
Yeah. I think those are all amazing options. Deck railing or railing planters, window box types of planters. Get outside of that area and still keep the space open. Hanging baskets, go up high and you don't have to worry about taking up your floor space. I would say if you're a plant collector or want to become a plant collector or want to do a lot of plants, then maybe you're looking at a shelving unit and you're looking at collecting smaller plants. Maybe it's bonsai. Maybe it's, a couple house plants that take a summer vacation outside and come back in during the winter. Or maybe it's a grouping of pots. Maybe it's 5 or 6, pots down at the end of one side that are kind of grouped together that are close that you can plant plants. But I think great advice on thinking more vertically, kind of trying to stay contained within the planter or in the
Well, I know
space as much
hanging
as
baskets. I
possible.
mean, we carry a ton of hanging
Yeah,
baskets. I mean, I know you can talk about those much more than I can, but I know hanging baskets are another one that we've used, to accent different areas where maybe there's not a lot of ground space, get it up off the ground a little bit,
exactly. Yep.
maximize as much space as you can.
And think about those plants. I mean, like a sweet potato vine, a petunia, you probably aren't going to do because they're going to get pretty wide and
Sure.
pretty wild and crazy. But keeping them smaller. Even, I mean, I don't know that I'd go as far as saying like fairy gardening, but the smaller gardening where you can plant multiple small miniature conifers, bonsai type of thing gives you the feeling of a garden, but in a small confined space. So possibilities are endless for you, Alex.
It truly is. What if you're someone, though, who is not able to kind of keep going out there and keeping check on your plants? What about low maintenance options?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways to make your containers low maintenance. When you're specifically talking about containers, I mean, there's watering aids like your plant nannies, and you've got lots of different types of siphoning watering systems. Then it's how are you going to get water to them, and what's easiest for you? Do you have a hose nearby? Do you want to do it by watering can? What are you limited to? So, I mean, those are some of the things you think about. Then you start to say, well, I don't have a great source of water, or it's harder for me to get water. I want low maintenance. So then it's looking at the types of plants and saying, I want to go with an easier low maintenance plant material like succulents or cactus and things like that can take yucca, things that don't need a lot of water. When you're talking about smaller spaces, it can get pretty easy. I mean, I'll let Daniel run with that. I mean, we've done a lot of, I think, small space installations of like the artificial turf.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, and again, going away from the container side of things and focusing more on small spaces, that's where a lot of times if people don't want to have a lot of upkeep, they have, a smaller backyard, whether that's using an artificial turf or same concept, just putting in like a paver patio.
Yep.
There's basically, especially with pavers, that's literally no maintenance. And so that's when, if you don't have a lot of time to upkeep a garden, you don't have a lot of time to plant and mulch and do things like that. If you do an installation of like a patio, it has a lot of benefits from an entertainment standpoint, seating areas, but then you can accent that with some containers like we've been talking about this whole time to still kind of get the feel of the outdoors and soften it up a little bit. So artificial turf is becoming increasingly popular, and again, it all comes down to your plant choice. Watering is really, when you talk about containers and small spaces, if they don't have as much room in the ground, or there's not as much natural moisture in the ground, you have to supplement that with a little bit of extra watering. So trying to figure out how to do that. Obviously in our world, that's irrigation, but again, that's easier said than done. A lot of times getting water to those areas, even if you're going to pipe it underground and things like that, it has inherent challenges. And so that's the hardest part, I think, about it is obviously watering. They do require a little bit of extra water if they're not in the beds and prepped beds and stuff like that you can kind of help the moisture retention in the ground. So I think those would be the biggest challenges, and just going back to what you choose is going to be what's so important. And again, there's choices like rock and choices like boulders and other accent pieces that can give you the aesthetic of a focal point that isn't a big bush tree, blooming
statuary fountains. I mean, y'all just did a rooftop, right? Or like a big like patio, or kind of almost a urban style kind of garden that literally had no soil. And you use fountains and yes, container gardening, but furniture and rugs and outdoor rugs and all of those things help fill those spaces.
Absolutely, yeah. It was on like I think the 8th story of a building, and they had a big patio out back. And what we did is, we put in a bunch of elongated containers, like we were talking about earlier with you, Alex, and we basically kind of lined the outside of it to kind of give it the feel of a garden and being in the outdoors. But at the same time, it fit the bill and it fit the mold perfectly. Created outdoor living space for them, with how we kind of arranged everything, but it still felt like, they were going from a very large yard and they were downsizing, and that's what we run into a lot. And so people, you mentioned earlier, you have your favorites when you're coming from a certain area. And so we did what we could to try to incorporate some of those. Obviously, not everything can happen, but we had Japanese maples in pots, like we've talked about. And they were some of their favorites, and we incorporated that into that to be able to give them kind of the best of both worlds. And so outside of watering, they really have no maintenance at all. And
Yep.
so when you're dealing with those types of spaces, I mean, the real, maintenance and attention that they require is going to be watering. If you can water and or find a solution for watering, that's really going to be all you need to do, other than maybe changing out some stuff. And like we said, kind of leaning into the temporary aspect of it.
Awesome. Well, great. You got anything else left for us, Alex?
No, you guys answered my question pretty perfectly.
So we've solved Alex's problem. Hopefully we solve some of your problems if you're dealing with small space gardening, or maybe you want to create small space, or maybe you're thinking about downsizing, then you still have lots of possibilities.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us on the Bros of Gardening. Next week, we will be talking about entertainment spaces. So we kind of briefly mentioned it here today, but how are you going to be entertaining in the garden? So it'll be a lot of fun, and we'll get into that topic next week here at the Bros of Gardening. Thanks for tuning in.